In 1980, a monk enters a cave where outsiders are forbidden to go and explore its depths. He goes there not for discoveries, but to dwell in the cold darkness and engage in prayer. A light beam slides on the dry stone wall, and something white shows in a narrow crack. This is half of a human jaw, featuring two enormous teeth that are firmly embedded in the rock. In those years, locals ground bones from this cave into powder and took it as a medicine for healing. This one survived only because it resembled a human bone too closely and was deemed sacred by them. The monk takes the find outside and hands it over to his community's spiritual mentor. After that, she is not mentioned for almost 40 years, and she does not leave the monastery. When scientists finally get the bone and analyze the preserved proteins, something strange is revealed. She is very old, and she does not belong to a person of modern appearance. I will reveal to whom she belongs at the very end, as this answer changes everything. It affects every person living at this altitude today, without exception. And before that, we have to go through 6 other mysteries of Tibet, because behind each of them lies the same uncomfortable question. Who was here before us, and why are they still here today? The first mystery starts with a mountain almost every person on Earth has seen at least once. Kailash rises to 6,638 meters above sea level. By this region's standards, the height is quite modest, with dozens of nearby peaks being much taller. Everest is almost 2,500 meters higher, and thousands of people have climbed it. No one has ever climbed Mount Kailash in the entire known history of mountaineering. It's not about the route's difficulty. Experienced groups find the ascent technically feasible. The reason is quite different, and it holds stronger than any rocky wall can withstand. For 4 religions, this mountain is the center of the world, and climbing it is forbidden. In the 1980s, Reinhold Messner received an official invitation to attempt this summit. This is about the man who first climbed Everest without using supplemental oxygen. The one who spent their life going where no one had been, refused the offer themselves. He explained the decision. Climbing that mountain would take something from human souls. In the year 2001, climbing Mount Kailash was completely banned without exceptions. The mountain looks almost like a perfect pyramid, with its sides facing the cardinal directions. Along the southern slope, a long vertical furrow runs from top to bottom, splitting the wall in 2. 4 great rivers that nourish hundreds of millions of people originate in the area around Kailash. In old texts, this mountain was described as the place where 4 streams begin. For a long time, this was considered a beautiful image, having no relation to real geography. Then detailed maps appeared, and it turned out that the rivers really spread from almost the same area. But every year, tens of thousands of pilgrims from many countries visit the mountains. The full loop is 52 kilometers on a trail that rises above 5,000 meters. The oxygen in this air is about half of what it is at sea level. At night, it gets so cold that water in a bottle freezes right in the backpack. Some pilgrims complete this circuit in a way that is hard to even imagine from the outside. A person stands up, raises their hands, lies down on the ground fully, and stretches forward. Then he rises exactly the length of his body and repeats the movement once more. This way he measures 52 kilometers of stone, ice, and gravel with his own height. One such cycle takes about 3 weeks of almost continuous forward movement. The palms are rubbed raw, so flat wooden boards are worn on the hands for protection. There are also those who complete the entire loop in one day, leaving at dawn and returning at dusk. There are those who walk for 3 weeks, believing one circle erases a lifetime's mistakes. The trail rises past the glaciers, and here the sound remains just one. It's the wind and your own breath, which is always in short supply at such an altitude. Both groups stop at the pass, where the northern wall is visible in its entirety. People stand there in silence, as speaking at this height is physically demanding. And none of these people even try to climb up the mountain. It wasn't the authorities or the military who closed the mountain. It was a millennia-long agreement. In exactly the same way, the cave where that very jaw was found was also sealed off. If this ascent has already captivated you, subscribe to the channel right now. The mysteries will only get deeper, and the last one isn't about the stone at all. The first mountain was a place where no living soul ascended. The second secret lies where millions ascend, yet almost no one sees even a tenth of it. The Potala Palace in Lhasa is built on a rocky hill about 300 meters high. The city itself lies at 3,700 meters, higher than almost all other capitals on the planet. The building has 13 levels and over 1,000 rooms for various purposes. The height of the palace itself is 117 meters, which is like a modern 40-story tower. The main white part was built in the 17th century in just 3 years. Now imagine what it looked like on the slope every single workday. Not a single car, not a single crane, not a single normal road to the top. People and pack animals are lifting stones, earth, and heavy logs as they make their way up the slope. A living chain stretches from the foot to the top of the hill from dawn until full darkness. A person who is just strolling here lightly is already breathing heavily and stopping frequently. And then he climbs up with a basket of stones on his back, day in and day out. The total weight of the lifted material is measured in hundreds of thousands of tons of stone and soil. It's as if people manually moved an entire modern residential block onto the mountain. Inside, there are about 10,000 altars and almost 200,000 individual statues. It's not a building in the usual sense of the word. It's an entire city, folded into a single mountain. The walls at the base reach a thickness of 5 meters, which is the width of a small room. The entire structure is held together by stone and wood, without steel or a single nail. According to descriptions, molten copper was poured into the lower part of the masonry.
They did this because of the earthquakes that occur in this area with frightening regularity.
The palace has withstood them all and stands without a single crack in its base. Modern buildings in seismic zones are typically designed for a lifespan of about 50 years. And this structure has stood for 4 centuries straight, carrying an entire mountain on its back. But the strangest part of this story is not about the construction, but about the silence. While the work was underway, the very ruler for whom the palace was being built died. His death was concealed for 15 consecutive years so that construction would not stop halfway. The officials explained that the ruler had gone into seclusion and was not meeting anyone. Records from that time say a monk who looked like him appeared at rare ceremonies. He sat motionless and said not a word, and his decisions were announced by his close associates. For 15 years this deception lasted, and no ambassador raised the alarm. For 15 years, an entire country lived by the decrees of a man who was no longer there. The palace was completed, and only then was his death publicly announced. Inside the hill there is a small cave that was carved out around the 7th century. It's almost 1,000 years older than the current palace, and that changes everything. So the place was chosen for a reason. The palace was built over an existing shrine. No one can say what existed on this hill before the cave appeared. It's a mystery to all. The tourist route goes through a few halls, while all other areas are closed to visitors entirely. Would you venture down to the lower levels if such a door were ever opened? And once again, the same question arises. Who was here before us? Potala has kept everything, including those things that she never shows to anyone. The third secret preserved the walls and the belongings, but lost every single person. In western Tibet, there is a valley where the earth resembles dried clay, sculpted by the wind. For 700 years, there was the Kingdom of Guge, which is not mentioned in school books. Its capital, Tsaparang, wasn't built in the usual sense. It was carved out from within the rock itself. People chiseled out rooms, staircases, and corridors in the soft stone, ascending floor by floor. A vertical city emerged, with upper levels connected to lower ones by tunnels within the mountain. Temples and the ruler's chambers were at the top, warriors lived below, and others at the bottom. A hidden passage led from the fortress down to a water source at the valley's bottom. It was a siege mentality, crafted by people who were preparing to hold out for a long time. According to researchers, the kingdom was home to around 100,000 people at its peak. It traded in salt and gold, minted its own coins, and maintained correspondence with neighboring lands. In the 17th century, all of this ceased to exist within just a few seasons. It is known that there was a split between the ruler and his brother, who led the monks. It is known that the brother called upon a neighboring kingdom for aid, and the siege began. Then there's just emptiness, because no one ever saw the inhabitants again after that. There are no signs of resettlement, no new villages, and no mentions in foreign records. 200 years later, tax collectors arrived here and returned with just one word: empty. There are two completely incompatible stories that are told about the last ruler of Guge. One version, he surrendered to the enemy to save his subjects' lives. On another, he climbed to the very top of the fortress and stepped off the wall. The neighboring kingdom ruled this valley for half a century and then left, and it remained empty. None of the versions explain the main thing. Where did all the other people go? There is also a second version, more calm and therefore even more unsettling. During those years, the climate cooled, rains ceased, and barley stopped ripening. The valley might have stopped feeding people, so they left one by one, unrecorded. Yet the temple wall paints stayed vivid, as if the artist just stepped away briefly. There is a cavity in the rock under the fortress, accessed by a narrow, low passage. Inside, the dry, cold air serves better than any preservative could in this place. Bodies lie on the stone floor, and they have no heads. No skulls have been found so far, neither in the cavity itself nor nearby. And there were far fewer bodies in this cave than the people in the kingdom. The walls remained intact, the city stood, and dishes stayed on the stone shelves. Only the people who conceived and built all this are no longer here. And the question returns again, only this time it sounds noticeably colder. So far, we have talked about what people have hidden from us. Next comes what the earth itself hides. And this is a completely different scale. The fourth secret lies right under the feet of anyone walking on this plateau. Lift the flat gray stone from the path at 5,000 meters high. If you were to split it open, you would find inside a perfectly coiled spiral, just like that of a seashell. This creature lived in a warm, shallow sea and eventually died on its ocean floor. The roof of the world was once a seabed lying far below the water's surface long ago. Between two ancient continents, an ocean stretched thousands of kilometers wide and deep. Then the continents came together, and the ocean floor began to rise slowly upwards. It continues to rise, adding a few millimeters each year without fail. The age of such shells is measured in tens of millions of years. They are older than all the surrounding mountains. The average height of this plateau is about 4,500 meters high. This is taller than the highest point in most countries around the world. The area is so vast that half of Europe could comfortably fit inside it. Imagine a territory the size of several states, lifted entirely to the height of the clouds. Long before the advent of science, locals collected such spirals in the beds of mountain rivers. They were considered sacred, wrapped in cloth and passed down through families for generations. Take such a stone in your hand. It will feel heavier than it looks and cold in the sun. For centuries, people held direct proof of the existence of a vanished ocean in their hands. They simply didn't call it evidence, they referred to it as something sacred and holy. The Tibetan Plateau rose so high that it's often referred to as the Earth's third pole. There is more ice here than anywhere else outside of the two true poles. And so, within this ice lies the second half of the very same mystery. On the Gulia Glacier, scientists retrieved a cylindrical core over 300 meters long. This is the height of a 100-story building, stretched not up, but deep into time. Each layer in such a column represents a separate year, like rings on a tree trunk. The very bottom layers were formed about 15,000 years ago, long before agriculture. At that time, there was not a single city or a single field on the planet. Working with such an icy pillar is more like an operation in a sterile room. The outer layer is sawn off, the next is washed with alcohol, the last is dissolved with pure water. Imagine a researcher standing at night over this pillar, peeling back layers one by one. He realizes he holds a continuous diary of the planet spanning 15,000 years. From these layers, not only viruses are read, but also dust, volcanic ash, and the composition of the air. A column like that is transported in refrigerated containers, and a thaw on the way ruins the season's work. And at the very heart of this diary, viruses that have been frozen all this time are discovered. In total, 33 groups were identified, and 28 of them were unknown to science. That is, modern biology saw most of these findings for the first time in its entire history. There is no danger to humans in this. Such particles are destroyed immediately upon extraction.
What's important is something else, and the study's authors say so directly. Glaciers around the world are retreating, releasing what they've held for millennia. This is also where the largest rivers of Asia begin, and it's no coincidence. Water from these glaciers reaches about 1.5 billion people downstream. It turns out that the highest and most uninhabited place on the planet is connected to half of humanity. Are you closer to the thought that this ice is better left untouched? Or to the idea that it needs to be studied down to the last frozen layer? The Earth here turned out to be younger and more dynamic than it seems. Now let's see what people have hidden in this vibrant young land. The fifth secret looks so modest that people drive past it without stopping. In the Chongye Valley, there are mounds that look like regular hills from afar. These aren't hills, they're tombs of rulers who held Tibet over 1,000 years ago. The largest mound stretches about 130 meters long. At the top, there is a small temple, but archaeologists never entered the mound. The mounds were not built at random, they were oriented towards peaks considered sacred. Satellite footage revealed that most burial mounds face specific mountain ranges. This suggests these are not just graves, but a system meticulously planned, down to their orientation. Small mounds were excavated by robbers in ancient times, but no one touched the largest one. The exact number of tombs in the valley is unknown. Estimates range from 10 to 20. Ancient texts describe in great detail what was placed inside with the ruler. It speaks of gold, weapons, armor, and of the living people who followed in the footsteps of the king. These descriptions can't be checked because the main tomb hasn't been opened. Egypt's Valley of the Kings has been fully excavated and revealed to the world. The Tibetan Valley of Kings still lies hidden under a layer of dry earth. And this is not a ban from one side. It's a sum of faith, politics, and a very inconvenient altitude. These rulers were buried in the ground, although this custom was later abandoned in Tibet. So the mounds belong to a faith that was on this land before the current one. This is a direct bridge to the sixth secret, as that faith also left behind words. Before Buddhism arrived, there was a kingdom known as Shangsheng in this land. It had its own beliefs, calendar, script, and language unique to its people. The capital is described as a silver palace carved in the rocks by the river's upper flow. All that remains of the kingdom today are a few ruins and a very small number of texts. Even less remains of the language. It is read by literally only a handful of specialists worldwide. Picture an elderly person sitting over a page, deciphering words one by one with great care. He is the last in a chain that has stretched here from deep in the millennia without pause. When he closes the book for the last time, the sound of these words will disappear forever. At the same time, religious books preserved entire fragments in this very language. They were copied by hand for centuries, often without understanding the meaning. For centuries, people copied words whose meaning no one could explain to them anymore. Each generation of scribes lost a part of the meaning, and it's now impossible to restore it. Of an entire people, only sounds remain, which soon no one will be left to utter aloud. It feels like rewriting the manual for a machine you've never even seen before. And in the east of the region, there are towers that just don't fit the usual landscape at all. There are about 250 of them, and the tallest rise to nearly 60 meters high. Inside such a tower, a person sees only a stone shaft stretching upward above them. Even more astonishing is the fact that outside their valleys, they were almost unknown to anyone. These structures truly entered scientific discourse only in the 2000s. Before that, hundreds of stone towers as tall as 20-story buildings stood outside history. Some of them are not round or square in cross-section, but star-shaped, with rays. French researcher Frédéric d'Aragon dated more than 80 such towers using carbon dating. It turned out they were built continuously for about 1,500 years. They stand in an earthquake-prone zone where modern buildings regularly collapse. The towers endured dozens of such tremors, remaining almost perfectly upright. The secret is that wooden layers are laid inside the stone masonry, acting as a shock absorber. The star-shaped design distributes the load better than a simple square or circle. The problem is, no one knows why these towers were built in the first place. There are different versions, from watchtowers to symbols of wealth and places for observing the sky. None of them explains why such towers are placed in desolate, uninhabited canyons. People have built hundreds of complex structures, yet left no explanation for why they did so. What did you notice for the first time in this video from what you heard? And now we return to where this whole story once began, to that cave. To the cave where outsiders are forbidden, and to the monk with a broken jaw. The cave is located at an altitude of over 3,200 meters. Services are still held inside, so excavations have been impossible for a long time. The permission to work inside was granted to the researchers only decades after the discovery. They removed 11 layers and found stone tools and animal bones with signs of butchering. These layers suggest that people lived in the cave about 190,000 years ago. From deep within the ground, remnants of the Denisovan's ancestral material were found. So, they returned here again and again for tens of thousands of years without fail. The cave was not just a random stop along the way for them, but a home for a very long time. The jaw lay with the spiritual mentors for decades before it reached the university. The standard analysis of the hereditary molecule failed. There was too little material left. So researchers tried a different approach and analyzed proteins inside tooth enamel. The proteins turned out to be stable enough to survive to this day, almost without loss. The age of the find was about 160,000 years, and this amazed everyone. It belonged to a Denisovan, a separate branch of humans that died out tens of thousands of years ago. Before this, Denisovans were known only from a few small fragments from a Siberian cave. A whole branch of humanity was known to science from a handful of bones the size of a finger joint. The jaw itself was larger and more massive than ours, and its teeth were almost square. Such a person would look alien among us, but he certainly wasn't an animal. He lived in these mountains when the glaciers reached much lower than today. He kindled the fire, processed the catch, and worked the stone, just like all people did. And this branch ends up on the Tibetan Plateau long before the arrival of our ancestors. Consider what this means in practice, not just on the pages of an article. Creatures once thought to be a primitive sideline lived in places where modern humans struggle to breathe. They endured the cold, the thin air, and winters that can kill an unprepared body in just one night. But the real blow wasn't even that. It was in the analyses of living people. While studying modern Tibetans, geneticists discovered a rare variant in a specific gene region. This region governs the body's response to oxygen deprivation in the air. At high altitudes, a normal person's blood thickens and their heart starts to overwork. Tibetans do not experience this. Their bodies receive oxygen differently and function calmly. Such a variant could not develop so quickly on its own in isolation. He came from outside, from the Denisovans, through a mix of peoples tens of thousands of years ago, and it is found in exactly two places on the entire planet, in ancient Denisovan bones and in the blood of people living on this plateau today. The people who walk around the sacred mountain today carry within them a part of an extinct species. The one who learned to breathe at this height first never disappeared from here. He dissolved into those who came after him and remained inside them forever. The question we asked in every section finally gets its answer at last. Who was here before us, and why do they still remain here now? He is not here as ruins, texts, or legends, but as something much more profound. He is here in the blood of the people who step onto the path every morning and simply breathe. And this divides everyone who has made it this far into two camps. The first camp is convinced that man came to the plateau and adapted to it himself. The second camp believes that without foreign blood, it wouldn't have survived here. Share in the comments which camp you feel closer to and explain why. The monk, who brought a bone fragment from the darkness, held the answer to our origins. He didn't know and kept silent for 40 years, not deeming the find important.
Almost 4 decades passed between the discovery in the dark crack and the answer to the question. All this time, the answer rested calmly on the shelf, in no rush to go anywhere. And nearby, similar bones were ground into powder for centuries and drunk as medicine. We are used to thinking that history is only what is written in thick books, but most often, it lies in the crack at the entrance, where no one's shown a flashlight. Tibet doesn't hide anything from us intentionally, and has never done so. The mountain stands open, shells lie on the path, a bone lay right at the entrance. We call these things mysteries only because we start asking questions too late. And somewhere up there lies the next fragment we're still blindly walking past.